Hello and welcome to the Subjective Space with me, Sindhu Rajasekaran. Today we have a wonderful guest, Dr. Jordan Kistler, who is a lecturer in English at the University of Strathclyde. She's an expert in 19th-century literature, Victorian poetry, the intersection of literature and science, museum studies, and Gothic fiction. Welcome to the Subjective Space, Jordan.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're absolutely welcome. I'm so excited about our conversation because, we're going to be talking about some fun stuff.
Yes, hopefully.
Okay, so let's start with talking about, your recent work with museums, right? Where you have been exploring the role of narrative in museum displays, like of facts and fiction. So tell me a little bit about that.
Yes, so as you say, I'm really interested in how narrative structures work within museums. All museum displays are kind of guiding visitors through in a structured way. And they're very often making use of narratives like the hero's journey, buildings roman, progressive narratives guiding you through a story. And they're often using kind of tropes of like science fiction or fantasy to take you back in time or to outer space as whatever the display asks for. So yeah, I'm interested in how those narratives are kind of implicitly at work and what the effect might be if they were more explicitly available to the visitors to museums. So I think kind of, they know the path they're meant to follow, but they don't necessarily think, oh, this is just like reading a storybook.
Yeah, which is very interesting, right? Because I have a daughter who is 8, almost 9 now. So when I take her to a museum, for instance, I would like to go in a particular way, but she would just go and mix things up.
Yep.
So that's like a whole narrative that forms in itself, right? So I saw a picture, I think on Twitter that you'd put up where there was a cockerel with, I think, these helmets. So what was that about? Tell me what is going on there?
So that's about my own daughter, who these days is 14, very grown up. But when we first moved to Glasgow and she was 9, we still love to go to the Kelvin Grove Museum. It's a fantastic space. And they do a lot of really interesting juxtapositions across their collection. So it's not just like the natural history displays and the art displays. They mix things up in ways that I find really exciting. And that bit is my daughter's favorite bit, where they're kind of drawing comparisons between the natural world and natural adaptations and man-made things. So the cockerel, they're thinking about kind of the crest on its head and how, helmets like Roman Centurion helmets use a similar design. But we started affectionately calling it the war chicken. And it's our first stop still. Every time we go to the Kelvin Grove, we go straight to the war chicken.
That's hilarious. And actually, that's very cool, to think of it.
Yeah, there's something very whimsical about its display strategy.
Yeah, very poetic. So now let's talk about, you're an expert in Victorian lit. And so the intersections between Victorian science and fin de siècle decadent literature, that's what you look at.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting because my work for the last 5 years, I've been digging into the archives, about the late 19th century as well, but in British India, which was also a very sort of decadent time in India. The British were scandalized by how profane India was, and they're like, oh my God, we need to change this. So tell me about what got you interested in this time period and in this particular subject of the science and the lit.
Yeah. So it goes back to my own PhD and it ties into the museum stuff. My PhD was on a poet called Arthur O'Shaughnessy, who worked in the natural history departments of the British Museum because the science collections were in the main museum at that time. They now are down in South Kensington. But he wrote pre-Raphaelite kind of decadent poetry. So he was very much bridging the sciences and the arts. And I was just initially really charmed by the space of the museum kind of allowing him to have this career. He would go on his lunch breaks. He'd go from the basement, which is where they put all the kind of gross stuff in jars, which is what he worked on because it needed to be cool. So he'd go from the basement up into the main museum, past things like the Parthenon marbles, and then into the reading room, because the library was also at this site at the time, where he'd read medieval French poetry, where you'd have no access to that kind of material except as someone who was in the museum. And then he wrote a fantastic collection based on the poetry of Marie de France. So I thought that kind of intersection of a bunch of different disciplines in a single space was just really, really exciting. And that lingers on in my museum work today. But it also brought me to the ways in which these artistic movements were really, really engaged with science. So although he was a professional scientist, lots of these writers, like people like Walter Pater, were really conversant with science and were really responding to scientific ideas. And I think probably in a way that we are today, right? They saw themselves at a moment of crisis, kind of post Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species. These new scientific ideas were really changing how they thought about the world. And they were thinking about it a lot and responding to it a lot. And I think it's really equivalent to the climate crisis today, where a lot of contemporary fiction is engaged in a really deep way with science and environmental science, thinking about it as something that affects our everyday lives.
I was going to ask you this stuff a bit later, but I think now is a good time, right? The science of decadence, and you've written papers about this. So let me just quote some stuff that you've written, and then you can elaborate on, what you thought when you wrote it, and how it sort of connects to today, because we're also in a very pessimistic sort of space right now. And people listening, Jordan's also from America, so so she is between these sort of different worldscapes. You write, the pessimism of 19th century science stemmed from the brutal world of industrial capitalism in which it was developed. Decadent writers then incorporated both scientific ideas and language into a literary style obsessed with decay and decline. So we live in that space now too. So could you tell me a little bit about this, sort of decadence, individualism, and science at the end of the 19th century, and how science returned to decadent literature to pathologize certain modes of artistic expression as yet another sign that certain types of individuals were degenerate?
Yeah, so I think you're right. It's a really similar moment. People at the end of the 19th century felt like they were potentially living in the end times, which I think a lot of us, we wake up, we scroll through the news, and we might feel the same way today. And, there were a lot of different factors that caused that. There was a general sense of the decline of the British Empire. So what you were talking about with your work, that ties in a lot to what I'm thinking about as well. The empire gets so big across the 19th century. It is, by many measures, incredibly successful, but there are points of tension all across. There are small scale and some very large scale conflicts happening globally as colonized countries resist the British Empire. And this made people at home at the imperial center incredibly nervous. So there was this general sense that the empire was winding down, which ended up being largely true. Not that they could predict the First World War coming, but the height of empire, we could say, is probably in the 1890s, and it kind of slowly goes downhill from there. So there was this sense of pervasive decline. And in a way that I guess I hope is true today too, the really avant-garde artists of the period ran with this theme. They interrogated what the empire was doing. They predicted its downfall. They wrote back against it in really powerful and provocative ways, criticizing individualism, free trade market, laissez-faire economics, the idea of kind of eugenics, social Darwinism. All of these ideas were so current at the end of the 19th century, categorizing some people as fit for survival and other people as not fit. And the writers I look at are pushing back against that. So I think it's a nice thought that to look to a past moment that's similar to ours and to think, the arts really stood up to it. They pushed back against it.
Which is very interesting about science, to just go back to, connecting the past and the present. The people who are sort of the problematic people also are sort of the people who are making scientific technological advancements, or they're in charge of it. I think you must have heard of how the latest satellite or whatever blew up, right?
Yes.
That Musk thing. So it's sort of like we're at this place where it's sort of the science of decadence, right? Like who, I mean, are we at a point where we're like, you feel like things can get really bad or really good from here? So in the sort of late 19th century mindscape, right, they were also thinking that, oh, we're at the peak of civilization, or we're about to sort of make leaps of whatever, right?
Yeah.
So how does that reflect? Like you said, people are writing back, but was there also in literature, was there also this sort of positivity or excitement, like we are like, the people, the humans are going to conquer everything?
Certainly. Yes, absolutely. I think, there are people who saw science as the way forward, as we do today. And of course, science was in many ways the way forward. Huge breakthroughs across the 20th century, eradicate large amounts of disease, extend
Mm,
lifespan, do away with the devastating infant mortality, lots and lots of good things.
mm,
But of course, also innovations that made the wars as deadly as they were. So
mm,
writers like H.G. Wells, who I've worked on a lot,
mm,
science fiction writer, starts writing in the 1890s. He's sort of thinking about both of those things. He is
mm,
excited by science and all its possibilities, but equally, he sort of foresees the potential of science to be an oppressive force. So lots of people love to say that H.G. Wells predicted the First World War. He has a
mm,
story about the Germans coming to attack in tanks.
mm,
Around the time he's writing that, a lot of people could see that things were going wrong with Germany. So he
mm.
wasn't, this mystic predicting the future. But I think he was really tuned in to the fact that science can be used for different kinds of progress. And I think we see this in Musk, right? What Musk thinks progress is really different than what I think progress is. I think progress
Mm,
is healthcare for all.
mm,
Musk does not think that. Musk thinks it's, wealthy people on Mars.
mm,
Those ideas are almost identical to the end of
mm,
the 19th century, where again, they're thinking about getting people on Mars. That's a very common trope in science
mm,
fiction of that period. So the idea of taking colonial expansion from Earth
mm.
to the stars was very prevalent at that time. And I think it's hilarious that it hasn't gone away, that those kinds of people are still saying, but there's more to colonize out there.
Yeah, I mean, this is what's amazing about studying history, right? Because you find all of these themes that sort of come again and again. And
Yeah.
also in Indian sort of philosophies, it's always cyclical. Everything comes
Yeah.
back because time is so temporal. And, it's like what we think is like the past is actually sort of now. So, which is very interesting. So now let's talk about some other exciting things that you've been working on. Let's talk about the representation of women in late Victorian Gothic fiction. So, to make a confession, I've not read a lot of Victorian Gothic fiction. So, my interest in vampires started with Twilight. So it's very recent. But I'm very excited about generally that world. So, you've written so many papers about this. You've written Rethinking the New Woman and Dracula. You've written Mesmeric Rapport, The Power of Female Sympathy, and Bram Stoker's Dracula. So tell me about your take on female vampires in Dracula. And you also speak about the idea of feminine sympathy, right, within the narrative of Dracula, and how that ties into the New Woman and feminist movements of the time. So tell me give our listeners a sort of overview and your idea on this.
So this really stemmed, as you can see, it kind of sits at angles to my other
Mhm.
work. There is science involved, and it is 19th century, but it's a little bit left field. And it really stemmed just from teaching. And when you teach 19th century literature, you're going to end up teaching Dracula at some point. I think I've been teaching Dracula every year for at least a decade. And I'm not planning on stopping anytime soon. Um, and the students respond in really typical ways, which is a sense of the two main female characters. So there's the character of Lucy, who is a beautiful upper class woman. She is proposed to by multiple men. So all the men want her. She is Dracula's first victim within England. And then there's Mina, who is married to Jonathan Harker, the one who travels to Transylvania, who is instrumental in the plot to end Dracula. And students react in really typical ways, which is they say, oh, Lucy is this hypersexual woman because all these men want her. And the novel punishes her with a pseudo-rape scene because she is staked through the heart. And all the men come together to stake her. So they're like, the novel hates women, it's misogynistic. We're putting Lucy down for being this hypersexual new woman. And the novel loves Mina, the very traditional woman. And there are only so many essays you can read about that before you think, I've got to do something. I've got to do something about this, which is put in print the fact that I don't agree with that at all. And I think what's really crucial is that we can't understand feminism of the past through feminism of the present, because the goals of each wave of the movement are different. And so a lot of the criticism about Dracula was written in the 1970s during the second wave of feminism, which was very much about reproductive rights, right? The right to an abortion, the right to contraceptive, and bodily autonomy. So this sense that, women shouldn't be shamed for having sex, they should be in control of their own bodies. And then Lucy is read through that. And they say, oh, she's the feminist character. Mina, who gets married and has a baby, can't be a feminist. But the feminism of the 1890s was completely different. They were not largely interested in sexual freedom. They were interested in work outside of the home, in having money of their own, which obviously is so essential to protecting yourself against the kind of abuses that can come within marriage, but also just intellectual freedom, the ability to do something outside of the home. Lucy does not have a job. Lucy wants to be a housewife, desperately. She spends all her time before she dies dreaming of the big fancy house she's going to have and all the dresses her husband will buy her. Mina, on the other hand, is employed. She's a teacher, and she's working very hard to learn new technological skills, something very much akin today to coding. That would be a good equivalent, in order to help her husband when he starts his business as a solicitor. She's going to be his assistant. And so she is a really modern woman for the 1890s with a lot of incredible skills that women were not meant to have. She travels across Europe by herself. She fights vampires. She shoots guns. At one point, she kills a wolf. I just think, what could be more badass than that? So the papers were really trying to push back against a kind of reductive way of thinking about feminism of the past and the way in which Mina is valued for very feminine traits, for her sympathy. And again, second wave feminism was very much interested in the kind of women can do anything men can do. We're the same, right? There are no differences between the sexes. Feminism of the 1890s said, look, men have messed up the world. With their manly attitudes, they've driven us to this point of the kind of the decadence, the decline. What if we had some women who can bring empathy, can bring sympathy, can bring care, maternal care to a geopolitical level? And that's what women like Sarah Grand, who coins the term New Woman, were really thinking about in the 1890s. And I think Mina's a fantastic representation of that. She mothers the whole group and saves the day and kills the vampires.
Which is very cool, right? Again, whatever you said just now is so sort of relevant even today, talking about abortion and all of those things, and even working and all of this stuff. And it's just, but it's so interesting that I have the same problem too when I look at women's histories from India too. Like if you're going to look at it through the sort of feminist lens of today, and then you're going to disqualify a lot of those women, or in fiction and reality, saying that they're not feminist, but actually you need to look at what it was at that particular point in time. So tell me a little bit more about this sort of the sort of hypersexuality of the female vampire as well, right? And what essentially, I mean, it's still sort of stuck on even now, right? It's something that's a trope. So tell me a little bit about that. And as you said, that's sort of a reason why people would want to attack the whole thing, because they're like, oh my God, you're hypersexualizing the woman, sort of. So tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's absolutely a trope today. I've got a PhD student working on contemporary vampire fiction, and that's so much a part of it, of both being kind of physically alluring, right? The female vampire is always really, really beautiful, really seductive, and hypersexual. She is kind of available. I think that does stem from the 19th century, but I think it stems from a really unfortunate reading of those texts. So a lot of people come back to the day that Lucy is proposed to 3 times. And she says, I don't want to have to choose. I can't choose. And that this is read as her desiring 3 men. But what it is she is a woman who's never been allowed to make a choice before, and she doesn't know how to choose. So she lets her mother pick for her, and her mother picks the richest man because, of course.
Obviously.
And I think we still see this today, where there is a conflation or confusion between a woman being desired and a woman being hypersexual. The fact that men want a woman does not mean that she is promiscuous, but you see it a lot in rhetoric online. Cute girls on the internet are accused of being sluts all the time. Just because they are beautiful and men want them. And it's like, that doesn't mean anything about her or her behavior. And I think that is kind of at the heart of the hypersexualized vampire, that she is attractive and therefore she must be available. And that I think is really worrying.
But also then the male vampires are also very sexy. I mean, it's just the world that exists as it is. So okay, great. So now let's talk about the Victorians a little more, because I love the Victorians. And I'm just this is fascinating to me, right? Because the way the Victorians presented themselves in India, like they obviously didn't want to bring what's going on back home, all the other stuff, but they wanted to present themselves as very puritanical, very proper. And they were like, oh my god, you guys are so profane and so scandalous, like they're scandalized by you. But then they're so prude and stuffy there. But then there's a whole subculture or something else going on back home in England. So where you wrote this article, which is so exciting, in the conversation. It's called Gen Z's language might seem incomprehensible, but slang has always sounded that way. Just look at these 5 Victorian slangs and sayings, and you have all of that. So tell me about how this and a lot of that is like very witty and very absurd, this sort of Victorian language, right? So tell me about how were these like. To have historical context, was this like these are subcultures in that time period? Were they like frowned upon, but they existed, or what was this about?
I think the youth have always had slang. The words my daughter uses are different than the ones I use. The words your daughter uses are different than the ones you use. So no, it's generational. I think there is always this kind of misconception around the Victorians, because what gets left as cultural artifacts, today we've got any number of things. We've got podcasts, we've got TV shows, we've got TikTok. The future will be able to see a lot more of how we lived our lives, although through a very skewed lens if you only look at TikTok. But we've got great novels, we've got political papers. People like George Eliot are not recording slang in their novels, although Charles Dickens does. A lot of his characters use very slangy language because he's writing about a lower kind of socioeconomic demographic. So there's this sense that, the Victorians were so formal because the novels kind of preserve this idea of a more formal culture. But of course, that's not the case. Their more ephemeral culture very much had slang and humor and bodiness. They had pornography just like we do.
Oh, I was just going to tell you, I've been reading this book and it's full of pictures from Victorian porn. It has a lot of Victorian porn.
Now, anyone who wants to push back against the idea of the prudish Victorians should just Google some Victorian pornography, because it's crazy.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell me about some of the words that you speak about in the piece that you wrote. So some of the stuff that stood out to me was, let's see, what is establish a funk?
So that means to sort of stir up trouble, and purposely to kind of yes, I guess the equivalent today is kind of gossip, right? Like
Yeah.
you can kind of drop something into a group and watch the
Yeah.
ripple effect.
Mhm.
And it comes from boarding school culture. I think a lot of this slang actually does.
Mhm.
As someone foreign to Britain, I
Mhm.
find still the entire culture around the kind of the private schools
Mhm.
bizarre, and the language they have bizarre. And so a lot of this slang sort of comes from those cultures. Um,
Mhm. What is pod snappery?
That's a great one. That's a Dickens one.
Mhm.
And it delights me. Podsnap is a wonderful character in a Charles Dickens novel who just thinks that everything he does is completely the right way of doing things.
Mm.
So he's a very conservative, middle class guy who does the same thing every day, and he can't imagine why anyone else wouldn't live their life the way he does. But also, he can't understand. He's a kind of Marie Antoinette, let them eat cake. He's like, well, why
Mm.
would the poor complain? Because we're the
Yeah.
richest country in the world. And it's like,
Yeah.
well, because you have all the wealth. Um, so it's
Yeah.
that kind of closed-mindedness,
Mm.
assumption that just the way you do things is
Mhm.
the proper way, which I think we can all think of people even today who
Oh yeah,
behave that way.
absolutely. Super self-righteous. What is Dree your beard?
That is, yes, one that comes from the Scots. And that's just like, it's like owning up to your weirdness.
Nice. So just be weird. Like that's just
Yeah.
to say, be yourself. Nice. Another one that was very interesting was Evening Breezes that you wrote about, right? Which is sort of like, what was it? It was like sort of talking about fake news. Was that what you said?
Yes. Yes, it refers to the tabloid papers that came out in the evenings
Mm-hmm.
and were kind of considered much trashier than the morning papers. And they would partially pick up stories off of the morning papers. So they're kind of cribbing from other sources. Um,
Nice. Well, see,
but
the
also, yeah,
Victorians are
fake
very much
news.
like us. Like there was so much going on then, which is so similar to now, right? Because what is the media now anyway? And we're all sort of figuring out what is fact, what is not. We have evening visas even now. Tell me some more about some more of these sort of slang words from the time period.
So it's not really my area of specialism. So I kind of cobbled together that bit for the conversation, which the call came through looking for Victorian slang. Um, but my interest is more widely in pushing back against the idea that the Victorians were so
Mm,
different from us.
mm,
And I think it's really important to acknowledge that these are just people, just like us.
mm,
They had silly, witty, funny culture, just like us. They had good things and bad things. And I
mhm,
think that's particularly for students really important to recognize that these are not, the 19th century is not that long ago. And we are
mm,
still feeling the reverberations of their culture. Stuff they put into place still has huge impact on us today, but also
mm.
that you can relate to these people.
Mm,
Um,
absolutely. Yeah, we still sort of, a lot of stuff that happened then or was established then is still part of our culture now, which is we're still undoing a lot of that
yeah.
stuff. So, okay, great. So I think the Victorians are always a very interesting sort of topic for me, and I can just be like, oh, tell me more, tell me more. But so tell me about your academic praxis now, and you as a writer, you published a book, and you're also an artist. So tell us a little bit about how you choose what to put into which sort of space.
Yes, well, I'm on research leave at the moment, so I'm meant to
Hmm.
be finishing a book right now. And as always, it's going a little bit slower than I'd like it to. And that's a book about the 19th century British Museum.
Hmm.
Um, yes, so I guess I do just let stuff, my research sort of go towards what interests me.
Hmm.
Um, my partner and I have a saying, which is goblin articles, which is like the kind of one-off article you write for something, a weird idea you have that you're just like really interested in. It can't be a big project, but you're like,
Hmm.
oh, I'll do a goblin article. And so I've got a whole list of potential goblin articles that I keep when these ideas come to
Was
me.
the slang one a goblin article like
It's a
that?
bit of a goblin article, yeah.
Yeah.
And actually the Dracula ones were too, where I just got to a
Hmm.
point where I was like, I need to say this somewhere
Yeah.
publicly. And I've got a lot of those. I'm like, oh, I just need to say this somewhere.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important. I think, big research projects take a really long time. I've been writing this museum book for much longer than I wish I was. And I still really love the material, of course, but you get to a point where you want to see it out there. And I think it can be really easy to get bogged down by those kinds of projects. So having the Goblin articles, the fun stuff that keeps you going, I think is really important. And I'm very lucky now that my work on historical museums has brought me into contact with a lot of contemporary museums and contemporary museum curators. And so I'm getting to do a lot of really exciting projects in museums today that I guess keep me sane.
Yeah.
When I can't think about the book any longer, I can go. I've been running creative writing workshops in the Hunterian Museum in Glasgow for teenagers, and they're doing kind of fantasy writing around objects in the museum, which are just such fun. It's so exciting to see what kids create and to see them engage with the museum in that different way. And so doing that kind of stuff, I think is really important.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to see how, say, even my daughter who's 8, engages with museums, and like, because she's into video games, and like the way she sees the world is so different from how, I'm like, this is a historical artifact. So that means something totally different to her. So that's very interesting. So tell me, are you allowed to say more about your book?
Sure. Yeah. It'll come out with Edinburgh University Press, hopefully in 2026. And as I said, it's about the 19th century British Museum. And I'm trying to reconstruct how the public, and particularly the working class public, thought about and used the museum. And particularly the ways in which they kind of helped to shape the way the museum both operated and what it displayed across the 19th century, and how they pushed back against some of the narratives that were at work in the museum.
That's fascinating.
So, for instance, at the early part of the 19th century, the collections were completely unlabeled. So nothing to tell you what anything was, which I guess happens sometimes in contemporary art museums. And the idea was they were designed for a very particular audience, right? They are thinking about a, public school, Eton educated, Oxford graduate, man of means coming to look at things, things that he would have seen things similar to on his travels, right? So things like the Parthenon marbles are not supposed to be confusing to the well-bred gentlemen of the early 19th century.
They already know what they're looking at.
They know. They've probably been to the Parthenon. So it's all meant to be quite explicable. And the language around the museum was just like, yes, you can just access the truth of these objects by looking at them. And then as the audience started to change, as middle class and working class people started to come to the museum, the narrative became, oh, you don't belong here if you can't understand these objects. So that kind of overpowering sense that they make sense on their own was really exclusionary to huge parts of the British public. But they pushed back against it. We've got letters from people signing, a mechanic, a working man, saying, obviously, I don't know this. I don't know Latin. I don't know Greek. You have to tell me what it is. I want to learn. I want to access these things.
Like, what am I looking at?
What am I looking at? I do have intelligence, but I need you to give me something too. And I think that's really exciting that they do eventually label because of that pressure. It's not a choice they make on their own. It is that the public says, no, you need to make these. They say, we pay for these. These are taxpayer funded. These are our objects. And you have to make them accessible to us, both in terms of labeling them and in terms of the hours at which we can come to the museum and look at them.
Well, that's really interesting, because obviously the museum is like a constantly changing sort of a thing, right? Because even now we're, to decolonize the museum as well, to sort of say what's going on here, so that's really fascinating. So tell me a little bit about you as a lecturer and as someone who teaches. So tell us something, tell us about what you teach, what you're currently teaching, and how that's been.
Yeah. So I teach the 19th century predominantly, although because Strathclyde is a small department, we all pitch in to the kind of, the first and second year modules. So we'll teach stuff from the early modern forward, which is always fun. Getting to give a lecture on Jordan Peele's Get Out is great. So I like the Gothic across all periods. But yeah, I teach a Victorian Gothic module, and that's where I'm teaching Dracula every single year.
Fun.
But it's great, the students love it. And I think anything the students enjoy reading is fun to teach for that reason. Although I love to make stuff that they think they won't like exciting as well. I think it's really important to get them to see that things are fun and interesting, even if they don't like them. There's so much that's interesting about an object you don't like, a book you don't like.
There's so much to say that why you don't like it.
Why you don't like it.
Yeah. And also about your creative writing, you were saying that I saw some posters of the workshops that you've held in the museum. So tell me a little bit more about that, and what you were hoping to see from the writers that you were engaging with, and what they sort of surprised you with.
Yeah, so they're themed around fantasy writing in the museum, thinking about fantasy as a kind of a new way of getting into the objects. And particularly thinking about kind of world building. So starting from an object and imagining a magical world around it. And I think this is really an exciting way for young people to approach the museum, because it is really very similar to a kind of scientific or historical way of approaching an object. If you're looking at something from 4000 BC that, people in the long past used, you're imagining the world it's in, right? You're imagining people who would use it, people who are really different than you, people whose lives are really different than your own, using this object and what role it has in their society. So it's a very similar one, even if their society is made up of fairies.
Which is very likely.
Which is likely. So, but I think it's a nice way of getting them into the mindset of a scientist or a historian. And really thinking about objects, not just like, oh yeah, it's another thing in a case, which I think can be the experience of walking around a very traditional museum. But thinking about these as, man-made things that were for a purpose. They had a use. So in the Hunterian Museum, we might have things like scientific instruments. They've got these stone balls, Celtic stone balls that are, 6,000 years old. We don't really know what they were for, but they serve probably some kind of ritualistic purpose. So that's great to say, we don't know what these are. The curators don't know what these are. What do you think? What would your characters do with them?
Yeah.
And I think the kids respond really well. They come up with really exciting stuff, funny stuff sometimes. And very much thinking about how fantasy is related to our own world, but, envisioning things slightly different. So hopefully at the end of it, and we've done 3 of them, we've got another one coming up in April. I guess we're hoping that they've had new thoughts about how literature works and new thoughts about museums and how we interpret the past and the natural world.
This is so cool. I think this is a great way to get younger folks to get interested in the museum, because it's sort of, they're not. So now it's to say, oh, look at this and imagine what this could have been about. So this is great. So thank you so much, Jordan. I think we're almost coming to the end of our podcast episode, but this was really great chatting about all your goblin articles.
My goblin ideas.
And your larger research work. And all the very best with your book that you're writing. It sounds really, really interesting. So thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been great.